Hi, everyone. Welcome to the sponsor Symposium number 3, titled Improving the Patient Journey with Better Use of the Data Found in Existing Systems. My name is Elliot, and I'm the Market Development and Partnerships Director at Petal, and I'll be your moderator today. We're thrilled to be a sponsor and host this session at eHealth 2022. This session is going to consist of a live presentation with Q&A. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll get to them throughout the conversation. And if there's any that we need to reserve for the end, we'll have a few minutes then. As a Canadian leader in digital health for the last decade, Petal develops innovative digital platforms that enable real-time care orchestration with over 250 employees throughout Canada. Petal proudly supports the ongoing digital health transformation occurring across our nation. We believe that the right technology has the power to change health outcomes, and our mission is to build world-class software platforms that empower healthcare innovators to improve access to care by driving operational efficiency. COVID-19 has changed our relationship with technology forever. Canadians expect fast and convenient access to care. However, this is difficult to achieve for many reasons. Our conversation today will focus on the patient journey by providing perspectives on the challenges faced by healthcare organizations surrounded by new technology, the clinical impact of these new technologies, and finally, a summary of the benefits of the risk taking during a period of rapid innovation. Please join me in welcoming to the virtual stage Patrice, Gilbert, and Dr. Darren Larsen. I'll have them introduce themselves and we'll kick things off. Patrice?
Thank you very much, Elliot. So my name is Patrice. I'm very glad to be with you today. I have a technical background. I'm an engineer, but we've been working in the clinical sector and in healthcare for more than 10 years. So very happy to be with you today. Darren?
Thanks, Patrice. Hi, everybody. I'm Darren Larsen. Nice to see so many of you in this session today. We're almost at 100 now, which is fantastic. I am a family physician for a long time. Spent a lot of time in the e-health space with work at Ontario MD. For those of you who are aware of that organization, just this past month, a month and a half ago, actually, I've moved to TELUS Healthcare Centers. I'm now the Chief Medical Director and Corporate Medical Officer for TELUS Healthcare Centers across the country. So it's great to be here to talk about the patient journey and the ability for moving information and data across the care spectrum. So I'm really happy to be part of this mix.
All right, thank you for those introductions, Patrice and Darren. We're going to kick things off with our first topic. That's going to be regarding patient journey challenges associated with the proliferation of digital health tools. Patrice, do you want to kick things off with your perspective on the current digital health landscape and kind of what's going on and why we're here today?
Absolutely. So as you guys have seen during the pandemic, but way also before the pandemic, we've seen a surge in the different tools going on in Canada all around. And that was seen as a very innovative spectrum and also movement that started, and we needed that. But the challenge is right now is that there are many tools, they're not all integrated. And I believe that this proliferation is now being a problem or an objective to streamline all the different tools that we have right now. So I think that we're in the middle of this innovation phase where we've seen different tools, and now we have to ask ourselves as an industry and as customers and providers where we're going with that and be able to work together, because at the end of the day, we're looking at the patient journey and what patient they're facing to access to care. But I strongly believe that we're in this phase of innovation, and now we have post-pandemic era to ask ourselves how to work better with the different tools that were created in the market.
Yeah, I would agree, Patrice, on that one. I mean, from the patient side, I mean, as a physician, I see the challenges of the patients every single day in front of me in clinic. And I've got to say, COVID was really hard on people, right? It was hard on those of us doing the care. And we see, record numbers of burnout in doctors, and even more so in nurses these days. We're seeing difficulties in access to care for some services. We were really far behind in things like cancer screening early on in the pandemic, and thankfully in most provinces we've caught up now, and in some cases even moved ahead of where we were in 2019. But with the digital tools we've got in front of us, I look at my time at Ontario MD when we were looking at virtual care products alone. We went from maybe a couple or three in the market to 45 that we listed on our webpage in the first month of pandemic. So the sudden explosion all of them saying, we're great, look at me, buy me, work with me, put your data inside me, without any real conversation with the patient over why or how or to what end. So there's been a real problem, I think, with just in some cases too much choice. And then, as I always say, we have a hard time sorting out the bright, shiny thing, which is the brand new kind of cool startup, cool app, cool, I'm going to save the face of healthcare kind of product, versus the stuff that actually gets things done. And it's hard for me as a clinician to sort through that. I don't even know how patients will begin to. Never mind the proliferation of tools that can be used in daily care from the point of view of collecting data on things like your smartwatch, or putting applications into the cloud from your own data into applications in the cloud through a mole monitor or a blood pressure measurement tool, et cetera. And then, as you said, once those products exist, they exist in these little isolated silos. And there's very little capability, even though we have standards in place for data portability, there isn't a lot of desire or reason from the business perspective for some of these applications to work together. And I think we're going to have to think some brave new ideas in the public policy space that might actually include regulatory issues, legislative issues, and even funding issues to make that happen. Ultimately, for patients, it just needs to work. Same for clinicians. And here I am at a company that has 9 EMRs and 3 virtual care tools. Like, even we're having within the industry this idea of needing to bring things together in real time in a very, very active way. And we're going to see some catapulting of that happening over the next year or two.
But you're absolutely right. So the ecosystem, we need at some point some sort of drivers to drive the economy, where some communities will be able to find a really positive aspect to be working together and to sit, and some economic values as well. So at the beginning of innovation era, so what we see often is many companies, they want to keep everything for themselves because they want to prove to market that they're able to make a difference. But once we move the needle in this era where we need to work together, and we need to bring those conditions where we're going to have to work together to make that a success. And we start to see that as we speak, like large hospitals, they bring together many providers and they say, guys, we've been doing business with you like in silos. Now you need to be working together. If not, I mean, we're going to have to find an integrated solution. So big hospitals, big regions, province, they're going to have to pull out in these conditions and put that on the market so for us to work together to keep our market shares and to expand it as well. So I think that integration, interoperability it's the next big phase of the proliferation of what we've seen in digital health tools.
What do you think, Patrice, about building trust? Because one of the other issues too that I notice is that there's so much out there that our patients really have a hard time knowing who to trust and when to trust an application or a digital service, because there have been many letdowns over time, and companies come and go, products come and go. We haven't really invested the energy into building trust with patients, which involves showing up all the time, being honest, showing integrity, being very clear about our processes, very clear about where data is going, what it's going to be used for. It's collected for one purpose, used for another, doesn't cut it anymore. We have to be super clear on the what and the why. And I think building trust is going to be super important with patients before we can, or actually maybe not before, at the same time as we're building trust with governments who are funding a lot of this work to say, look, in a public-private partnership, we can do better than simply build on your own or procure in a very slow process. What are your thoughts on the trust piece?
So that's a very good point, because at Petal, what we've decided is that we carry our customer's brand. So when we work with Quebec, we're not customer facing, we're not patient facing. So this trust, as a company, we have to prove that to the hospitals, to the government, to the ministry, that we're going to be able to be okay with the patient data and everything in terms of security. But we decided in Canada, because of this, the healthcare system, that Petal will be serving hospitals and medical clinics and providers, and not being forefront in terms of of patient recognitions. So that was a decision that we made. Because of that, we decided to support the existing players in the market. But your questions is also really important for newcomers and companies that would like to penetrate the patient-facing market. And I strongly believe that if you're not able to carry this, everything that you mentioned around security and data hosting and everything, at the end of the day, it's going to bite you back. You got to strongly invest into that. And at Telus, I'm sure that you guys are facing the same thing, that because you're not only on the healthcare side, you're also on the telecommunication sides and other side of the business. So the Telus brand is very important for you, and I'm sure that you're putting a lot of effort. Any comment on the kind of effort you guys are putting to protect this from a patient perspective, Darren?
Well, I mean, the first thing for me that comes up as a physician, never mind who I'm working for, but even as a patient, is give me access to my data, first of all. So, I mean, I want to know that what you're doing with it is being used for good. I want to know that it's being kept privately and securely, and that the rules are in place from the regulatory bodies and from the governments in terms of legislation around how that data can and should move. But we also have to say, look, some of these regulations are old. Like we had a revision to HIPAA 2 years ago in Ontario that was 14 years in the making, right? We had 14 years before the first privacy legislation and the update 2 years ago, which that update was actually really meant to, tighten up the privacy and security rules around what you can and can't do, but also open up that idea of circle of care, because data doesn't move with the patient. And if we're going to get into really, truly integrated healthcare systems, we have to find a way the data wraps around the patient and moves with them from one care environment to another. And we collectively, corporate Canada, governments, physicians, our health system creates so many barriers for that to happen. It's actually incomprehensible to me. So one of the big things we're working on is got to give patients access to their data. What does a fully open chart look like? How will that change the face of healthcare from the point of view of them truly getting engaged in their situation, either from the wellness perspective to stay well, or from the illness perspective to prevent or mitigate the effects of chronic disease, for instance, or the effects of not being most up to date on things like screening or monitoring, et cetera. So that's the biggest thing we're looking at now. And someone had posted in the chat around, how do we get to sort of a singularity or one common product? I don't know that we need to do that. As long as we have the correct standards in place for data to flow and the correct governance structure around how that happens. So, the rules need to be clear, and they need to be evident to both patients and providers and to the companies and governments working with them, so we're all playing on the same page, right? And we're singing from the same songbook. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but it's happening now, and I'm seeing some significant progress over the next 1 to 2 years.
Absolutely. So we share the same view, Darren. This is what we see in the market today. We're very glad to be in this post-pandemic era where we see a lot of willingness to make things happen. So we didn't see that before the pandemic. And I think that what COVID brought in is the urgency and the speed at which things are changing right now. And I think that it's a very positive thing, but we have a lot of work to do. But it's at the same time, it's very energetic and super positive to see that happening in Canada right now.
Yeah, and I joke over and over again about what did it take to make virtual care happen in Canada? A burning platform, i.e. a pandemic, and a couple of billing codes. That was it. We were ready, actually. I think we were ready as a profession to take this on. Patients were certainly more than willing to take part. So sometimes just a small little pivot's required. I mean, in this case, pandemic's a big pivot, but I mean, we could have got to the billing code conversation in most of our provinces years ago. A couple did, but most of us did not. And, we saw a big uptake, probably more than was expected in the provinces that took billing into account for virtual early on, pre-pandemic, but now we're all there. And now we're having to deal with this fluctuation of what's virtual, what's in person, what does it cost, what's it worth? Those are for governments and medical associations to tackle, but it's a really interesting world of how quickly change can happen with just a small pivot for everybody's benefit.
Absolutely.
I think in the spirit of time, we're going to move on to our next sort of conversation. I'd really like to get the audience involved. So right now we're going to start a poll, And what do you think is the biggest challenge patients face in accessing care? Is it care navigation? Where do I go for care? Do I go to the ED? Do I see my primary care physician? Is it the provider availability and wait lists? Can I see my primary care physician? Is it going to take 2 weeks, 3 weeks? I'm on a wait list. Do I have any visibility into that? And finally, are there technology adoption barriers? We have all this technology at our use. Are we using them to their full capabilities? Are there other ways that we can use them? Do we have all the knowledge enabled to use them? So I'm interested in learning what you think are the biggest challenge patients face in accessing care. So we're going to start the poll and we're going to run it for a few seconds here.
Did we preload them with, maybe we pre-vetted that conversation by our first bit of talking, but.
All right, we got a lot of answers coming in.
Yeah.
All right, well, give it a few more seconds. All right,
sorry,
go ahead, Darren.
I was gonna say, it's interesting to see these numbers rolling in on things like provider availability, and that in some ways, providers have never been more available than they were before because of the use of virtual care tools and things. And I look at my own practice and my wife's practice. My wife theoretically is 3 days a week. She's now working 5 days a week because not only is she seeing her patients, but she has this whole other virtual piece happening on top of that in her practice. And so what we've seen in some offices, wait lists have actually gone down. But the perception of availability, meaning like what do patients actually need and want? Maybe they want an in-person visit, and for a period of time it wasn't easily available. Maybe they're not sure how to access the care. Maybe that affects things. And wait lists on specialty areas for sure have skyrocketed because of the fact that so many hospital services were shut down during the various phases of lockdown. So that's a real issue.
Yeah, and just to circle back on our last conversation there, I think there's a really interesting question where we're talking about interoperability and standards. So one of the questions from the chat from Alex was, do you have any further thoughts about the governance structure to standardize product capabilities? So who leads this? Who decides on interoperability standards? Is this a centralized procurement model for the province, et cetera?
So what I've seen not working is to take that from a theory perspective. So if we take a bunch of people coming from InfoWay Canada and big hospitals and in the market and the private, and we put them in a room and say, guys, you have 2 weeks to figure out what the integration pattern is going to be, then it's not going to fly. I've seen that in many other industries as well. I mean, it's very difficult. So what we see happening these days is real project and iterations. And guys, you have to work together, like as Darren mentioned. So we would like to have patient information to flow in different care environments. And for that, what would be the first the first proposition, and then we try to do something, and then we iterate, and it's through iteration with some of the vendors, but in real projects that I strongly believe that we're going to happen to go somewhere. But if we take the opposite way and say, oh, we're going to give 2 weeks to end up with something, I don't believe in that anymore. I don't know, Darren, what if it resonates with you, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I'm just reading the comments in the chat box around, medical resources and availability of providers. And I think, in some respects, our technology and movement of data has to mitigate some of this to a degree so we can find the right provider for the right problem at the right time. And that doesn't mean it's always going to be a doctor. As much as I am a doctor and think that the work I do is great, there are some things on our waiting list and our accessibility pieces that are probably better solved by non-physicians. And in fact, those people need access to data too. So the integration into their care environments is really, really important. We've got a lot of standards now. The question is, are these companies putting standards into place, and are they actually using them? And then what are the rules around sharing of that data so that the patient actually is well served, and circles of care, et cetera, are relatively loosely defined. So, I mean, we have to be super careful about access and the portability piece and who's viewing and auditing. So I think, integration is technically quite possible and probably can be done in relatively short order. I see the much bigger piece around that and the difficulty around the human side of it, which is kind of policy and regulation space. I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, Patrice, because I was partly reading the comments at the same time, but.
That's okay. I was only comparing that if we need to be stronger in terms of relationship to create these standards and interoperability way, that I was comparing the old ways that I've seen in different markets as well, in different industry, where we want to force the industry to do something and to come up with a standard from a theory point of view. And I don't think this is what we need right now. I think that we need to iterate. We need to bring and we need to iterate within existing projects and real live projects, because we don't know what we don't know. And there's a bunch of stuff that we need to learn and working together. And I think that if we do that enough in Canada and we have enough partners doing that, then we're going to converge towards something that's going to go, it's going to make sense, but it's going to be achieved through iterations.
And I think you guys experienced that in Quebec with your work on COVID, correct? I mean, I saw the Assistant Deputy Minister, the Deputy Minister of Health speak around the experience of Petal there. And I think we had similar circumstances in Ontario, with the development of, say, the Covaxon vaccine management system, where, built on a platform offered by Salesforce, supported by Accenture, meaning getting it right in clinics, then the installation, then the adoption. But now the really important thing and the interesting thing is going to be, how does that data, because now I'm looking at that data set as being the single most accurate source of data around patients in our province, up to date, pretty much up to date. How are we going to use that for more? And then how do you integrate that data into other areas of care? So like, what about using that same thing for chronic disease management? What about using it for care pathways in our running or proposed Ontario health teams here for integrated care systems? So there's a lot that can be done with the integration once you figure out, how and where and why that data moves and for what purpose. And again, the trust thing comes back, because I think we have to make it super clear to patients, by the way, this belongs to them, that data. It's their data, my data as a patient. We got to be super clear how we're using that and what the circle of care means. I think a lot of it is implied, but many of these rules needs to be, I think, written in language that people can consume. And someone in the box, chat box also talked about, what does this mean for patients, who are perhaps not speaking our main languages or are having trouble navigating digitally, et cetera? We can't forget about them. The digital divide, I think, stands to be greater and greater and greater in this space if we don't bring everyone up to speed through a real attention to digital literacy in our general population, which we really kind of ignore and neglect.
Yeah, I agree with you. What we've seen in France, it's they are putting together what I call access desk, so to pick up the phone. So, but they want to have like experienced nurses to be able to be to do conversations with the patient and be able to find what's the provider abilities and stuff like that. So we're still aligning offer, supply and demand, but they also not only provide a website or a digital tool to the patients, but also a phone for the access desk. And we're seeing Quebec government doing the same as well in primary care. So not only you want to provide your population with digital tools, with iPhone apps and stuff like that, but you also have not to forget about people who are not very aligned to that. And I think that there is a balance and a movement that we're going to see between the analog way of answering and being in contact with patients in the digital ways as well. So.
Precisely.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this a bit, and I brought up the slide a couple minutes ago, just the clinical impact of getting it right versus not getting it right. And I think that's a really important question, where we have all these tools at our disposal, but what are we actually measuring from a clinical standpoint? And Darren, as a practicing physician, you've seen firsthand, technologies come and go, and from your experience, how do we know if it's making a difference from a clinical perspective, and how can we move from there?
I mean, there are many ways to do that. I mean, we don't we don't consistently measure in practice, except for the point of view of quality improvement. And I think that there are many, many practices now that have an ongoing quality improvement process in place. And certainly a lot of the organized primary care models and groups do. That doesn't measure everything, obviously, but it certainly starts the ball rolling. And if you think about what QI does in terms of measure one thing, and you start to look at other things, even as you're improving, we see some impact there. The one thing I noticed, though, from the physician's perspective, when we talk about measurement, is they immediately come back to this, like, well, how will my data be used to punish me? And I'm like, well, why do you think you should be punished? Are you doing anything wrong? And they're like, no. But I'm like, exactly. We've got to explain the accountability piece better, because I think we can't change what we can't measure. We all know that, but not everything we can measure matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. So this comes around full circle to, answering a why question. Why are we measuring this? What's the impact of measuring it versus not? What's the impact of getting it right? That's obvious. Hopefully people are healthier. They're in hospital, especially in expensive care environments, way, way less. Their transitions in care are significantly improved, because it's in transitions in care where most balls get dropped, right? Almost everything that's lost happens in a movement of a patient from one place to another, if they get there at all. Sometimes they're just forgotten. So warm handoffs are important. Like the clinical impact of doing this work well in the digital space is very, very real. We don't also do a great job of telling that story about where it has happened. If we don't get it right, though, what do we got? We got the spinning ball. We just do the same thing over and over and over again. And it's like insanity. You expect a different outcome by the same process. Absolutely not. We can't do that. More and more expensive. And what really, really worries me a ton is that patients will suffer here from the point of view of they're not getting the outcomes that they deserve. And we're not allowing them to do that because the processes in place aren't available to them, or they're not good for them. And from the provider perspective, on the nursing and physician side, I've got to say the biggest impact of not getting it right is burnout. And I don't know that we can really properly explain the whole impact of everything from pandemic to changing technology to just the demand for more on our clinicians out there. But what I see is a massive health human resources issue in the next 3 years. If we don't stop putting more and more on the backs of clinicians generally, that has no benefit and no bearing on improving care. So that, from my perspective, those two impacts are incredibly important: getting it right, getting it not right. We've got to consider both. And when we measure, we've got to ensure that we're measuring the things that show outcomes are improved, not just measuring for its own sake. I don't know if you agree with that, Patrice.
Absolutely. So what we've seen recently is that not only our customers are asking us that to measure the impact of our technology on the access to care, but also the impact on providers. So it has become now today a source of measurement into the project. When we deploy technology, we have to save provider time and streamline the process where providers they're involved with. We have to streamline that. So of course, patients' objectives, giving them access to care and everything, it's there. It's our primary objectives. But nowadays, we cannot deploy a project and not take into the account the providers' involvement into that and what's the reality is going to be into the project. So I think that you put your finger on a topic that is becoming more and more important, and we cannot not to look at that when deploying impactful technology. Even if the primary objective is still on the patient side, it has an effect on the providers, and they're asking us to measure that and making sure that the provider community, they're okay with the project as well.
Yeah, I think on the topic of measuring, access to care, and we were talking about different indicators and what should be measured, what shouldn't be measured. It kind of leads into our next poll, where we'd like your opinion. What do you think is the best indicator to measure access to care? So we're going to get the poll going right now. We're going to have a couple minutes. Are they wait time indicators? So is this waiting 36 hours until you see a primary care physician, or is it the wait 0, 1, and 2 for surgical, prems and proms? The third next available appointment. We may want to dive into that quickly. as I'm not sure everyone's familiar with it. I just learned about it in the last couple of weeks. And then finally, measuring access to other providers. So with an allied health pharmacist, we know going towards team-based models of care, how important connecting everyone within those teams is moving forward. So let's get the poll going and we'll see what comes out. Is it,
Are you launching that, Elliot, or is somebody else?
I think they're supposed to be launched. There we go. There we go. It's live.
Yeah, prems and proms for you. Those of you who don't know, these are outcome measures and patient-reported. What's the E? Efficiency measure? Oh my goodness, I should know this. Experience measures. So patient-reported experience measures and patient-reported outcome measures, those are prems and proms. Third next available appointment is a measure of how quickly you can see a clinician, meaning, one appointment out, two appointment out, third appointment out, how far away is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it looks like the wait time indicators seem to be the best indicator according to our group here. We're going to end the poll right now as we have about 10 minutes left as we head into our final topic, which is, sorry.
It's interesting when you're looking at wait times, right? Because the wait times have been measured for a long time in this province anyways, in Ontario, particularly around surgical services and high impact services that are going to be receiving big chunks of funding or where we see a significant service gap. So we have pretty good wait time knowledge around things like CT scans, MRI scans. We have wait times for cancer care being measured. We have wait times for surgical care, especially in very, I think, so high impact or high cost areas like cardiovascular surgery, hips and knees, that kind of thing. But we're not really doing much wait time measurement around like the wait 0 or wait 1. So wait 0 is like how long does it take to get an appointment with anybody, even just to get the ball rolling. Wait 1 for me is how long for me to get my tests completed, that I'm ordering. Then of course the next wait is I'm sending to specialists, how long to see the specialist. Then the next wait from specialists to doing procedures. We're measuring really well from specialists to procedures, not so well for the things up front. And I think those are super important from the patient experience perspective. As we saw early on in wait times measurement for surgery in Ontario, this is, a decade and a half ago, what would happen is the wait times to see a specialist were very long and the surgical waits were pretty short. And then when they started measuring, the opposite way around, it looked better to really wait for the so wait times for seeing the specialist were long and surgery was going to happen shortly after. Then we saw a direct switch to wait times for seeing the specialist are longer now, and then shorter, and the wait times for surgery are longer. Like we have to be careful about the effective measurement. I may have got that backwards in my explanation, but I think that the idea is when you measure things, you influence things. So you also have to have countermeasures to make sure that we're not doing the wrong thing with just measuring wait time in one area and affecting another. Great.
Yeah, there's one question here for both of you. Can we just dive into the TNA a bit more while we have a couple minutes while we're talking about these measures for access to care?
Do you want me to do that, or do you want Patrice?
Whatever. You can start, Darren, and I'll explain the thing from a technical point of view to.
Yeah. So there's a whole body of research on advanced access scheduling that looks like how do you divide your schedule into, direct appointment availability for urgent problems to be seen quickly, and the stuff that is going to be seen more electively on an ongoing or chronic basis. So your regular follow-ups, et cetera. One of the measures we have as a proxy for that is called third next available. So, I might have, if you look at my calendar for my clinic tomorrow, you might actually see that I have an appointment available at 9 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. And when you just do the first measure, it looks like I'm immediately available. And that might be because someone canceled, 5 minutes ago. So it's not really a good measure. The second appointment might actually be, maybe I've got an appointment for a physical coming up, which is too far out. That's probably not good enough. Maybe we've got an appointment for, say, a chronic care visit or a counseling session unfilled. The third, we kind of think by the time you get to the third appointment, you've taken care of the pre-scheduled things, the cancellations and general availability, and you've got probably a better proxy for how long your overall wait is to be seen in wait zero, right? So how do we measure that in a system? Patrice, you can talk about that.
Yeah, so what we do is that we take the demands, and so we always in the Petal system ask for what do you want. So we do not allow patient to cruise around and to choose what they want from a bunch of availabilities. So we always ask, oh, you've asked for this type of service, when is the perfect moment for you, this day, blah, blah, blah. And then we really have the demand. And then we can compare that to and run simulations where it's going to be the third next available slots. And then we accumulate that, and we're able to have a general metric for based on the demand on this provider, based on the advanced access modulation of his availabilities, what's the third next appointment availability. So this is by running simulations from the demands through the availabilities that we're able to come up with the average TNAs.
So the bottom line is we need some kind of measure for weights. None of them are perfect. I think that proxy measures are okay, but when I show those to a clinician, they kind of go, that doesn't apply to my patients, my practice, or my individual day. And they're right in most cases. So I don't think that we should be only measuring TNAs in terms of how available we are. I think we need to see it as one indicator, but also we have patient experience surveys coming from our quality councils where they say, over half our patients can't access care with their primary care provider or group within 24 hours of an urgent problem. Like even those questions about what does the patient actually see are as important as what we can see in detail in data. And if those two corroborate each other, then we have a really big body of work ahead of us to fix that. Where the two line up, it's great. They often don't line up, but then we try to take the best insight from both and make change happen.
Yeah, and what we see these days, just to finish on that, is that physicians now with technology, they have the ability to modulate their availability based on the source of the demand. So we have general practitioners, they can reserve slots in the morning for their own patients for urgent cases. They can reserve slots on top of that for redirections from ERs. And if those slots are not taken 2 hours in advance, they become back available on the web and stuff like that. So things that we were not able to do with someone manually managing a doctor's schedules. So they were more reluctant to open up an advanced access schedule because they were afraid to lose their time or not being efficient. But now with technology, it's more and more possible. So the TNAs is not the only thing that we should be looking at in taking that consideration, that we see more and more modules and options within someone's agenda.
I think it's somewhat easier to
go ahead, Darren.
I think it's going to be somewhat easier to measure in an institutional environment as well, where a lot of the processes are regulated or controlled based on things like an OR schedule or that kind of thing. It's much harder in the community to measure these kinds of things because so many influences. And it may be that someone's sick or you're on call and you suddenly have to run to an emergency department or whatever, and things get canceled and screw up everything for the week. So, I think we have to look big picture in the community.
Yeah, and our final topic, we only have a couple minutes left here, so they're really going to be a summary and some final comments. In this era of innovation, there's got to be a bit of risk taking on both ends, from both the private and the public sector. And I'd love to get both of your opinions, starting with you, Patrice, and your experience of how did we get here and where are things heading? Where that vision really meets reality.
That's a good question. So what we've experienced into good COVID, so a couple of hospitals called us and say, hey, Pat, we need to deploy Petal right away. We need it. So are you able to deploy it in 2 weeks? And said, no. we're not able to do that. So it's going to take a month and a half and something. And then the CEO looked at me and said, hey, Pat, do you know what I do today? I save lives. So I need you to help me save lives. Then we were talking about, okay, all right, so we're going to get back and we're going to deploy this thing in 2 weeks. And then a province called us and say, hey, Pat, we need to deploy a provincial-wide COVID test and COVID vaccine test. And we need that in 10 days. Do you know why? Because we save lives. And then all the risk-taking and innovation process, that forced us, the industry, to kind of reinvent ourselves and say, to think outside the box and say, okay, but to do that, I'll need to have access to your resources because we've never done that before. So then we created innovative pattern to have access to the data, to deploy, to test, and to really be innovative. But on both sides, we had to have the risk-taking willingness to say, let's do this. And that was thrilling. And then we greatly improved during this. So I still believe that we need to keep that going, and we need to keep up with the risk taking and the innovation, because as a society, I don't think that we have a choice anymore. We don't have a choice. We have to reinvent ourselves, and we need everybody around the table to succeed at it.
I mean,
right. And
COVID was
Darren, any last comments? 10 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, COVID was a low rules environment. And so a lot of so-called rules were bent to make things happen during COVID. And I think we have to figure out how to not bend rules all the time, but ensure the rules are flexible enough to make things happen. And even in my own company, where we have lots and lots of ability to innovate, you know, things always stop on questions of risk. And often those questions are raised by lawyers for good reason. But we have to then say, move away from you can't do that, to what will it take to make this good thing happen? In other words, there are things we may have to work around or work through or change to make it happen. And taking risk means, you know, asking a lot of wonder questions. I wonder how, I wonder why, I wonder when, and then figuring out the tools to make things stick. And that's where we're often stuck when we're worried about making a mistake. So in healthcare, sometimes lives are at stake. You know, that's a very high rules environment. But a lot of the stuff we're dealing with is not changing lives, it's changing experiences. And that's perhaps a lower rules environment. We probably have to sort those two out.
That's great. You know, as we wrap up, we just want to thank everyone for joining us today. It was a pretty spirited discussion, and we appreciate all the input and all the questions that came through the chat. As we continue with eHealth 2022, everyone can, you know, now move on to the day one closing host session. You can access these in the agenda section of the platform. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Patrice, or Darren. We're available for any of the questions that you may have. Thank you, everyone.
And thanks for staying to the end. Appreciate it.